Hello, Chapter 6. We are now looking at memory and the various memory systems. And I want to begin by just sort of going over this slide that I have, as a way of introduction to what memory is, and as a way of sort of introducing the topic from a psychological perspective. So when you look at the pictures in the top corner, in the top left-hand corner, you see the two children, and I think photographs are a really strong source of memory for us, right? Think about the times you've looked at pictures of yourself when you were little, excuse me, of your um, nieces, nephews, cousins, and how much they've changed. So a picture then is more than just this moment in time. It captures the feelings that we have about that moment in time. It captures the things that have changed since then. It becomes a stepping off point for us to remember other things that may have happened with regards to the people in the pictures that we take. The second picture in the middle is of the seaside, and I like to think of this as those wonderful family vacations we take. We've all taken them, whether it's to a cottage or to the ocean or to a theme park or whatever it may be. But those memories serve as a way to kind of go back and think about what that trip, what that time meant to us, and how it can be a fond sort of recollection of a happy time that you spent with friends, family, what have you. The third picture is of a jukebox, which um, yes, I'm too young even to have seen jukeboxes like this. But jukeboxes were popular back in the early part of the 20th century, right up until probably about the 70s or maybe even the 80s, that people had jukeboxes. I remember in university, actually, there was a jukebox on the table in this restaurant that I used to go to. But the point here is that music serves to trigger a lot of memories for us. Sometimes we hear a snippet of a song and we think about where we first heard it, or what we were doing, or how it impacted our life. And maybe it reminds us of a relationship that we had with someone. And, our song, so to speak, where you have a particular song that you had with a significant other at one time or another, or maybe even still. But the point here is that memories are triggered because of our brain's ability to sort of go back in time and to the storehouse of our memories and find this memory that's important to us. So we want to talk about memory in more ways than that, though. We want to talk about how we remember things. We want to talk about why we forget. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we can improve our memories in this particular module. So first of all, you might be asking yourself, what is memory? And I like to use some sort of psychological ideas to talk about this because, as I showed you in the first slide, memory can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But in terms of psychology, we're looking at memory as that place where we store everything we've ever learned, everything we know, everything that is important to us. And you might be thinking to yourself, well, I've forgotten a few things because I've been out of school for a few weeks, but it'll come back to you. When you jog your memory, when you look at the things that you've learned, the things that apply, things that are important to you, because we need that continuity. Could you imagine if we weren't able to remember events surrounding our family? If we forgot people's names? Now, we've talked a little bit in the past about dementia, and that's one of the sad things that happens is that people do, their memory does deteriorate as a result of having brain deterioration that causes dementia. But for the most part, we are able to remember things that happened to us when we were younger. Now, there's there's discussion about how early in memory we have, and some of you may think of memories that you had when you were an infant or a child. I remember one student telling me one time that they remembered something about themselves in a crib, and I thought that's pretty early memory. Most of us remember when we have language to remember and explain. The third piece about memory that's important to remember is that ability to take information that we think is going to be important, useful, that we want to use in the future, and store it in a place where we can retrieve it so that we can talk about it. So for instance, you will be wanting to remember this for a future test that will start next week. What you will be doing is you will find a way to connect it to either something you've already known or something that you've already reviewed, and then you will take that information, store it, and then recall it so that when you come to the test question, you can pick the right answer, A, B, C, or D. We have three separate parts to our memory, though. Sometimes we don't need to have that memory for very long. This is a sensory memory. So for instance, you're walking down the hall, you have a mission in mind that you're going to a classroom, and so you see somebody out of the corner of your eye, but you really don't have time to talk because you want to get there on time, especially since it's a test, for instance, if it's a day of a test. So you just sort of, you don't keep that memory in your mind. You don't keep everything about that person. You wouldn't be able to give any details. However, if you think you might need it, you will transfer that information to your short-term memory. And short-term memory is sometimes called working memory. We're going to look at these in depth in a few minutes. And the final subsystem of our memory, is our long-term. This is the stuff that we really feel may be important, that we want to keep, that we want to have for a long time, that we want to have forever. Sometimes you might think, well, I don't remember all the details about such and such an event, or I don't remember everything I learned about such and such a subject, but it may be that it was not stored properly, because anything you're going to use beyond a couple of minutes goes into your long-term memory. So let's look at more in depth at each of the three systems. When we talk about sensory memory, it could be visual, it could be auditory, it could be something you hear. I like this graphic because it's sort of the idea of you're going down the highway really quickly and you really don't have time to look at everything because you have to concentrate on the traffic, flow of traffic, and you have to figure out where you're going and, you know, where's your turn off and all that sort of thing. So you're not really paying attention to the details on the side of the road. You don't really focus on them. You might decide you want to come back somewhere, you see an interesting restaurant, for instance, and you say, oh yeah, I'd like to come back there. But then you're already transferring it from your sensory memory into your short-term or long-term memory. So actually, visual sensory memory is only a fraction of a second, and sometimes that accounts for the thing that we think we saw something, but we didn't. Like that, I don't know, maybe you think you saw somebody walking through a field, but you couldn't tell because you were too busy concentrating on the road. Auditory memory lasts a little bit longer, but if you don't want to do anything with it, if you don't see it as important, it's going to go right out within 2 seconds. In order to better understand how sensory memory works, George Sperling decided to do a little test to see what happened when people were asked to recall rows of letters or items or pictures briefly on the screen. So what he did was he tested sensory memory by briefly flashing an item. Just a couple seconds, less than seconds, actually, more like milliseconds. And he would flash it quickly on the screen. Then he would turn off the display, and he had 3 different distinct tones, which he shared with him before the display, which would signal what row he wanted them to recall. So he might do a knock, 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 for row 1, a for row 2, and a for row 3. So what would happen as a result of this is that he found that people's visual images or visual memory faded so quickly that they remembered maybe 1 or 2 letters in a row, but they would never remember the whole row, or weren't likely to remember the whole row. And again, that would depend on how many characters he put in that row. He might put, a string of 10 numbers, and people might remember 1 or 2, or a string of um, letters, and people may remember a bit more, depending on how you might be able to um, combine those letters in some way. Let's try it in the next slide. So remember my knocks. This was a row 1. This was row 2. And this is row 3. Okay, you can hear the difference between all of them, I hope. And we'll see how you do on the next slide. All right, so try and recall what you can from the visual memory from the last slide before I start talking about short-term memory. And some of you may have remembered a lot of the letters, some of them may have remembered very few, some of them you were confused as which knock was the knock that you were supposed to be, row you were supposed to be looking at. Okay, let's move on from visual or sensory memory, visual and auditory sensory memory, to short-term memory. Short-term memory is a little bit longer, but it doesn't store a lot of information. So we couldn't put anything, cram a lot of information in there and expect to recall it in the short term. So for instance, let's say you didn't have your phone on you. I know, God forbid, how can we go without our phones on us? But let's just for a second say your phone has died and you haven't had a chance to charge it yet. And somebody gives you their phone number. You might say to them, well, I can't, I haven't got my phone. I can't put your number in my phone to save it for later. But you think, okay, well, I can remember that long enough to between now and the time I have to charge my phone. Or can you? Well, you might be able to if you chunk the numbers together. But if it's a longer number, and you also had to say get their office number with their extension. For instance, like when you call McMaster, they have 5-digit extensions. So add that to the 905 number, and you've got a rather long sequence of numbers that you have to remember. Could you remember it all if you had to wait for a minute or two to go and charge your phone? Probably not. Mind you, you might do what some people do, and that is rehearse your list. Rehearse that number. Say it over and over again in your mind so that you do remember it and you can enter it into your phone and then call it so that you can get that person's number and leave a message about maybe an appointment or whatever the case may be. Okay, so short-term memory then is not, we don't keep things in there for long. And usually it's just short pieces of information. The standard is 5 to 9 bits. And when we say bits, we're talking about number digits, we're talking about letters, we're talking about words that maybe make sense together. It doesn't last very long though. It doesn't last very long. The rehearsal piece is helpful if you want to be able to use it for longer than half a minute. Finally, let's look at long-term memory. This is the workhorse of our memory systems because the capacity here is unlimited. Everything you've ever heard, everything you've ever seen, everything you've ever done, everything that's part of your life, you have the capacity to retrieve it if you've stored it. This is the key. This is the key, though. The key is getting it stored in the right place, in the right way, so that you can retrieve it when you're ready for it. And that's where sometimes our memory starts to fail us, because we don't necessarily find the right coding mechanism to get it there where we want it to be so that we can retrieve it when we need it. And again, we can make sure that stuff goes into our long-term memory by rehearsing. And you maybe do this sometimes when you're studying. You want to remember concepts for a course that you're taking, and you might just say them over and over again to yourself, read your notes over several times. Not the best way to study, but it is one way that people do study, and it is helpful for some people. But you basically are rehearsing, you're rereading, reiterating that particular piece of information so that you can recall it when you come to a testing situation. Long-term memory is divided into two subsystems. The first one I want to talk about is declarative. These are those things that we can easily bring to our mind, because we remember an episode in our life. We remember something that we learned. We remember something that has had an impact on us in some way or another. Declarative things can be thought of as events that you may have personally experienced. We call this episodic. So for instance, you probably remember what you wore to your high school, grade 8 graduation. High school is probably a little too recent, but let's go back a little bit further. Grade 8 graduation. You may remember what you wore. You remember who you went with, what you did, what it was like, all those kinds of things. We have these stored sort of in our personal memories because they're important life events. You're making that transition from grade 8 into high school. The other one that is considered declarative is the semantic knowledge. Now, what do we mean by semantic? This is such as the general knowledge that we learn in school. Things like our times tables, or how to add, how to subtract, how the capital of different countries, the 10 provinces, what the capitals are. All that kind of stuff is all considered part of your semantic general knowledge. And you've learned that from being in school, from reading books, articles, all those kinds of things, that web pages, whatever you may have read it from. And it's the reason we call it semantic is it's declarative, but it's not so much tied to a specific event. The episodic, you can say, is recall that is related to a specific event that we personally experienced, such as your sister's wedding, your cousin's bar mitzvah, those kinds of activities. You personally experienced them, you've been to them, you understand you remember what they were like, what they happened at them, if there was any interesting events that occurred within that particular event, all those kinds of things. And that would be part of your episodic memory. The semantic, on the other hand, is not tied to a specific time, although we can generally say that we learned in grade 2 how to add small numbers together. We can't really specifically say that it's tied to a specific event or time, especially when we get into the more broader knowledge that we've acquired through different activities. The second subsystem of long-term memory is called the non-declarative. And in the non-declarative, what happens is that we know what it's like to, ride a bike, or input something on a keyboard. These are motor skills. These are habits that we formed over time. We don't necessarily talk about, I learned how to ride a bike when I was 4.5, and this is what I did. This is how I turned the pedal. This is how I steered. This is et cetera, et cetera. You don't do that. It's just more of a habit. It's something that you just do, and it's harder to explain to another person how to do it. It's something that they have to do to understand how to do, if you get what I'm saying. Okay, that's the end of this particular unit, this particular module on memory. There will be 4 more modules after this one, and we'll look at different issues related to why people forget things, how we categorize our memories, and how we can improve our memories.